From the campus of the University of Kentucky, you're listening to Behind the Blue. I'm Cody Kaiser with UK Strategic Communications.
These are moments, yes, of celebration, but moments that sort of encourage people to stop and think, well, what are we celebrating exactly? What is this nation? What is this document, this Declaration of Independence that we're celebrating? And so that's one of the things the history department has wanted to do, is use this moment to foster conversation about the history. And so we have established this lecture series, this 1776 lecture series, where, we recognized here at UK, we have national and even international experts on this history. We have colleagues in our fields. Nationally, we can let's bring in some of the best experts we can find to share their knowledge, their research, and get these conversations going about what is it that we all share in this country.
That's Amy Murrell Taylor, the T. Marshall Hahn Jr. Professor of History at UK. As the United States marks the 250th anniversary of its founding, the University of Kentucky Department of History is helping the campus and broader community think more deeply about 1776, not only as a moment of celebration, but as a moment for reflection. Through its Celebrating 1776 lecture series, public events, film screenings, and courses, the department is bringing together historians, public scholars, and UK experts to explore the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the ideas that have shaped the nation across 2.5 centuries. The last time she joined us on Behind the Blue, we talked about her award-winning book, Embattled Freedom, and the national conversation around Confederate memorials. A conversation about how we remember the past, what we choose to honor, and how history continues to shape the present. This time the conversation moves to America 250, what it means to commemorate the nation's founding, how Kentucky fits into the story of the Revolution and early Republic, and why the principles of liberty, equality, and governance of, by, and for the people remain so alive in our national conversation today. Amy, welcome back to Behind the Blue. It's been a few years since we've had you on the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Now, the last time that you were with us, we were talking about your book, Embattled Freedom, and kind of the national conversation around Confederate memorials. Now we're here today and I don't think we're going to be without our parallels to some degree, but we're talking about the 250th anniversary of the nation's founding. Let's talk about that for a moment.
Sure.
The through lines between those two moments, because I think that you can look at today and the atmosphere surrounding today, but I know that specifically from that time period, there were lots of questions as to, are we going to make it? Is this experiment going to work? Mm-hmm. And, thankfully it did. But I feel like maybe to some degree, we're still continuing to kind of have some of those, or they keep kind of popping up over time. And maybe in the
those
last
conversations.
20 years or so, they've really kind of popped up again.
Yeah. Well, I think one through line between the conversations about Confederate memorials and the 250th is clearly, how do we remember our past? How do we look back on it and learn from it and celebrate it? And I think what we see in both of these moments is there's a lot at stake. This is not just, kind of something we do in our free time for fun. We're really getting at, what is this nation? What was it made of, and what can we expect of it in our present day? And that's something I think we're grappling with every day. And so these moments really kind of bring us together and sort of sharpen the focus on that question about what kind of nation are we and what do we want to be?
When people think about the American Revolution, I think most people would think about, the first thing is Boston, Philadelphia, Virginia, Yorktown. Where does Kentucky fit in the story of the founding? Because we were not a state yet or a commonwealth in 1776, but there were a lot of shared concerns about westward expansion that kind of fed into this, correct?
Yeah. Well, obviously Kentucky and Kentuckians, or the people who would come to call themselves that, were a big part of this revolution. And Lexington is named after the Battle of Lexington in 1775. Kentucky's technically part of Virginia in this moment. So men are mobilizing to fight, to leading this battle. But this is also kind of the hot spot of what you might consider to be one of the other battles for independence. There's the battle for independence from Great Britain, but then there's all sorts of smaller battles, or at least different ones, that are playing out. And I'm talking about with Indigenous people and some of the white settlers who had showed up in what would become Kentucky. This west of the Appalachian Mountains becomes a place where we see Indigenous people rising up and really kind of seeking their own war for independence and establishing their claim on land that white Americans are increasingly encroaching upon. So Kentucky is part of what we might consider to be the traditional revolutionary story, and Kentucky men are fighting in that, but it's also part of this other side to the revolution that hasn't gotten as much attention in our collective memory, but is going to be really crucial for the decades and generations to come.
And when the colonies were first established, I think a lot of people think that it was a short honeymoon between colonists and Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of harmony there for some period of time, I think. And then, as what my understanding of a lot of people's understanding of what the causes of the Revolutionary War was taxation, mm-hmm. without representation, things like that. But there was a lot of concern about land ownership, correct? Mm-hmm. And the British government did not want expansion. Like, they didn't want people moving into those places. And so, like, George Washington, for example, I believe was given a lot of land by Virginia, mm-hmm. and then was told, well, you can't really do anything with that. And so there was a lot of that kind of played into it, I guess. And then mm-hmm. as you gradually start to expand out, you're compressing where other people already are.
Well, what's really happening is you got to turn back the clock, another decade to the 1760s. And the British colonies and Great Britain had fought this war against the French and Indigenous people in North America, the French and Indian War. And part of the settlement of that was Great Britain agreed, okay, we're going to draw a line down the Appalachian Mountains. It was called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And we're going to claim the land west of that line, but our settlers aren't going to go take it. So they create kind of a murky situation. In retrospect, do we really think those white settlers weren't going to cross the mountain and go there? I mean, it might have been a little unrealistic for them to think. But this line had come because there had been steadily escalating conflict between the colonists, the white colonists, and Indigenous people. And you mentioned, there was moments of harmony. And I think that's maybe the way to think of it, that throughout the history of colonial North America, there had been moments of peace. And this is something that historians have paid some attention to, because I think there was a traditional sort of story, or there's kind of a conventional idea out there that the colonists come and they are like a steamroller rolling all over Indigenous people, killing them, whether by disease or by violent warfare. And it's not to say those things didn't happen, but Indigenous nations were very powerful, some of them. They had the numbers of people. They knew the landscape. They were pretty smart diplomats and negotiators. And so for a long time, they protected themselves and they kept the colonists at bay. And so there were some moments of peace, but this had been escalating. And so what that means is the American Revolution, comes as it's almost like the tinderbox is about to blow. And the revolution then becomes another front in that long-standing conflict with Indigenous people.
I think I saw something recently that was talking about Indigenous people and how the perception could be that these people were kind of nomadic and just kind of living day to day. But the truth is that they had a very complex society, had their own forms of government, had their own sort of trade systems worked out. And, a lot of that I think gets kind of washed away under this perception that when we came, they were just sort of these savages.
Right, exactly.
As they were kind of deemed, without any kind of real acknowledgement of the societies that they had well established and well in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of that sort of myth that the colonists just kind of plowed over them because they were, weak and couldn't really stand up for themselves. But when you really start to dig into this history, you see how wrong that is.
We could drive down that path in a completely different conversation, but kind of keeping it with the idea of celebrating this anniversary and talking about why this matters for both UK and Kentucky listeners. When we talk about the America's 250th, a lot of people, it's tied into the 4th of July, and so a lot of people are thinking fireworks and patriotic imagery and eagles and hot dogs and celebration. But from your perspective as a historian, what do you feel like we kind of should understand this anniversary to be, as maybe a celebration, but also some sort of, commemoration and reflection in a sense?
Well, I think reflection's a good key word, actually. And I think we see that with a lot of anniversaries today and in our past. These are moments, yes, of celebration, but moments that sort of encourage people to stop and think, well, what are we celebrating exactly? What is this nation? What is this document, this Declaration of Independence that we're celebrating? So, yeah, this is an important moment. And as an educator and as a member of UK's history department, we're really taking it seriously as a time when people out there are asking questions they might not ask normally and want to deepen their understanding of what is this nation, who are we, and what do we stand for, and why, and how did it get that way?
I kind of want to talk about this series that we're doing over the course of this year. Started in January and moving through the fall semester. And you've mentioned that before that this is meant to kind of help the UK community better understand this period so that it remains alive in our conversation. What do you mean by that? And maybe looking at this kind of time of deep political divisiveness, it kind of gives us a chance, like you were saying, to think about what it means, think about what those principles of liberty and equality and governance means. How can people connect that kind of to the present moment? Like looking at those things and then connecting it to kind of where we are in our lives.
Yeah. I mean, this 250th is taking place at a time that, I think this is just a fact. It's a politically polarized time we're in right now. And it's not the first time we've celebrated this country in a polarized moment. 1976, the mid-70s, coming out of Vietnam and Watergate. I mean, that was a pretty polarized and divisive time as well. But I think what this can help us do is think about, well, maybe we're on two ends of the spectrum on these particular issues, but what is the shared inheritance that we have? What is kind of the common ground that we have? And it's a body of principles. I think that's what's so interesting about studying this moment in the founding of this country is in these documents were bequeathed to us these very powerful ideas that have taken on a power in our history that I would say goes well beyond the wildest dreams of the founders. I don't think they saw how many people and different people over time would claim these ideals and take this country in the direction that they did. That is a shared inheritance. And I think that sort of stopping and looking at that and appreciating that, I'm not going to say it's going to solve everything. It's not going to suddenly bring us together in a kumbaya sort of moment, but maybe can help us develop some kind of vocabulary and some sort of common ground for at least having conversation. And so that's one of the things the history department has wanted to do is use this moment to foster conversation about the history. And so we have established this lecture series, this 1776 lecture series, where, we recognized here at UK, we have national and even international experts on this history. We have colleagues in our fields. Nationally, we can let's bring in some of the best experts we can find to share their knowledge, their research, and get these conversations going about what is it that we all share in this country.
It's interesting, the way you framed the bicentennial in 1976. I find that so fascinating because as someone who, I was born in 1973, so I don't have a lot of memories of that particular moment, but the residual of it, I remember being older than that as we got past 76, closer to 1980 and beyond, that there was still a lot of bicentennial memorabilia and bicentennial things that were still in existence. And to me, I am kind of able to look at that, and I think maybe a lot of people are, to kind of hold two ideas in their head at once. I can look back at the 1970s and think about the history there and study the history there and really dive into oil crisis and like you said, coming out of the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the settling, everything settling from that, and a lot of things going on even as you get towards the end of the 1970s with the Iran hostage crisis. And at the same time, I can hold in my head this idea of togetherness and this celebration. And it didn't seem it seems like those two things were kind of disconnected in a sense. We were still able to kind of have this celebration. And that could just simply be rose-colored glasses and revisionist kind of view of this. And when you're living in the moment, it was probably not like that at all. Much like now, maybe 25 years, 30 years down the road, we'll look back at 2026 and be like, oh yeah, we have these celebrations and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I find that part of it interesting that, my view of that is I can kind of compartmentalize those things.
Oh, same with me as well. I was 5 years old. And I remember wearing a Betsy Ross hat on July 4th, and we rang bells in the afternoon, and we had a picnic and all of that. And I loved the bicentennial quarter anytime I got one. So my personal memory is this was this moment where everybody came together as a united country. That's the 5-year-old view of it. But of course, there have been scholars who have studied that moment, historians of what we call historical memory, and have looked at the commemorations and have seen that actually at the time, the story of the founding that was being presented out there was actually quite contested in the 1970s. And some, believed that there was a sort of mythology of the founders that was being perpetuated without acknowledging some of their tensions and contradictions and shortcomings. And so there were competing narratives out there about what was the founding and who were the founders that we should be celebrating. So absolutely, we're seeing that same really dynamic today. So there's another through line. I don't know, kids today, are they going to come out of 2026 with the same kind of rosy view we had? I'm not sure. It's a different celebration this year, I think.
If only we had a Broadway rap show in 1976. I don't know.
That's true.
I don't know that Hamilton would have gone over
Hamilton
in
was
the,
not
in
big
the same
in the
way.
1976 celebration, but he's bigger this time.
Yeah. So talking about the speaker series, this Celebrating 1776 series, I just kind of want to run down the list of things that have happened and then moving towards the fall. So in January, there was a conversation with Joseph Ellis, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author. In April, there was a conversation, I believe, with Christy Coleman about the power of the Declaration. So then moving towards September, on September 2nd, there's going to be a public screening of highlights from the PBS film, the Ken Burns PBS film, The American Revolution. And we have experts from UK who are going to discuss the impact of the revolution across 250 years, which is free and open to the public at the Worsham Theater in the Gatton Student Center. How do you think that type of platform, because it's really expanded. I mean, when you think about where we are now with media, a documentary film, that was not something that we would have had in the 70s, 80s, until you got closer to the end of the 80s when Ken Burns really kind of got some traction with the Civil War and things like that. Mm-hmm. So how do things like that type of media, help bring the revolution to a broader public audience? And then tell me a little bit about how our experts what role they're going to play in kind of framing the conversation.
Yeah. No, I think we've seen some of these films, and it's not just the documentaries. Sometimes it's the, fictionalized drama out there. They have an enormous effect in sweeping up the nation and getting people talking in a way they might not have talked about before. I think Ken Burns' Civil War is a perfect example of that. I think this was not a documentary, but Roots in the 1970s got people thinking about African-American history and the history of slavery when they hadn't really been before. So I think sometimes these films in these moments, they reach people who might not be reached in some of our conventional classroom museum book sort of way. And often what they do, in one film, it's a couple hours, or in Ken Burns' case, it's much more than that usually, but it leads people to wanting to know more. And so I feel like the work we do as historians at UK is often very complementary to the films out there. That, okay, you've got questions after watching this film. Here's our classroom. Here's our books. We're here to extend your understanding. So the event we're having, yes, we'll show some of Ken Burns' film, but we've also brought out, or we'll have, a variety of UK experts on this founding revolutionary period. We've got two historians. We've got Jeremy Popkin, who is really an expert on the international impact of the American Revolution as a historian of the French and the Haitian revolutions. So he brings that expertise. Vanessa Holden is an expert on the history of slavery, the director of the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative. We have a literary scholar, Michelle Sizemore, who's also director of the Gaines Center, who writes about the literature of the founding period and the early republic. So how ideas kind of make their way into fiction. And then we have Hugo Reyes-Centeno, who is an archaeologist with the anthropology department, and he's been working on a fort up in Rhode Island, a Revolutionary War fort. So we've got, history, literature, archaeology. We're bringing all these UK experts together, and all of them are really doing a lot to advance our national understanding of the revolutionary period. So, we want to showcase the various ways UK experts are doing that, but also each one of them, I think, will help extend what's in the film. And, questions that arise, they are there to really help broaden people's understanding.
I think that having public events like this around this type of experience, like this documentary, is probably helpful in this day and age as well, because you mentioned Roots earlier. We were such a monoculture in some ways back then because, by and large, most people had 3 networks that they could watch. And so you were watching pretty much what everyone else was watching. And so I think part of the reason why we had some of those big mini-series kind of massive unicultural events is because that's what was on and everybody was talking about it because they were all watching the same thing. And now we're in such a fractured space with our media consumption because you have endless channels, you have endless opportunities for subscription services or YouTube or whatever. And so not everybody may have access or may know about some of these things because it is so kind of spread out. So it is, I think, really great to see that you can bring in some things supplementally to kind of draw attention to this and then draw attention. Like it's a nice thing that kind of builds off of that.
Yeah. And, we're teaching courses on the founding and the revolution and intro to U.S. history. So we want not just the public to come to this event, but our students to come and really, complement and sort of get this history on different levels, film, classroom, the experts, and so forth. Yeah.
In October 1st, we have an event with Patrick Sparrow. Mm-hmm. And that, to center things pointing back to Kentucky, deals with something called the Kentucky Conspiracy of 1793. Uh-huh. So tell me a little bit about this event and the work that's involved in this.
Sure. Well, first of all, Patrick Sparrow is the executive director of the American Philosophical Society, which I think it's relevant to note was founded by Benjamin Franklin back in the 1740s. It's like one of the oldest libraries in the nation. So he is going to talk about a little known event or series of events that take place in 1793 and basically pull Kentuckians, Kentucky men in particular, into an event that would really kind of shake this new nation. I mean, this is not long after the end of the Revolution and the Constitution. What's happening here are the French, so the Americans' allies in this revolution, they are kind of, you could say, scheming for New Orleans, which is in Spanish hands. And there's a whole secret scheme to try to take New Orleans, and they pull Kentucky frontiersmen into this to help execute this plan. So I'll let Patrick Sparrow provide more of the details, but it's a really interesting story about the first decade after the Revolution, really the first decade or the beginnings of Kentucky's own history, and the role of this place and these people here in Kentucky in some big global events.
How does the history department think, or what was the process like in kind of building this lineup out, and how it can kind of each thing can add to the bigger conversation?
Yeah. Well, when we first came up with this idea, I mean, we thought, we're the flagship research university in the Commonwealth. We really have access to so many great people and ideas. We need to get out there. And then suddenly when we started thinking about it, there were so many people that we could invite and so many different topics that could be covered. How do you choose? So we just tried to get a variety. So Joe Ellis, who came in January, he's kind of like the dean of revolutionary studies, Pulitzer Prize winner, best-selling author, biographies of Jefferson and George Washington. So we had him come. Then we had Christy Coleman come, who has not published a lot of books, but she has a long and distinguished career at Colonial Williamsburg, the American Civil War Museum, and now Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, working more in the public realm in the museum world to interpret this history. So we want to get her perspective, which is a bit different than somebody who's been writing books all of these years. We wanted to make sure and have some Kentucky focus to this. So Patrick Sparrow's talk will allow us to really get into Kentucky and its place here. In December, we're going to have Lauren Duvall from the University of Oklahoma, who has published a book about the home front during the Revolution and the way in which civilians get pulled into this conflict. She's got a new book out about it. And that's one that's going to allow us to, get away from the military and political war just a little bit and more into the home front and, look at women and look at families and see their participation as well. So we're trying to get topical coverage, but get different voices, coming at this from different professional backgrounds. And I think we ended up with a good variety, but of course there's so many more people we could bring and so much more that could be said. In addition to the speaker series, we're also looking at new courses for students this year that's tied to America 250. What can you tell me about those and the kinds of questions that students will be exploring through that? Yeah. Well, my colleague Mark Summers, who is an expert in American political history, is teaching a course on the history of the Revolution. So it is a course open for anybody at the university. It's called The American Revolution. And this is kind of the second of a 2-semester sequence he's been offering. In the spring, he offered the colonial history. So that's kind of a marquee central course. But other courses are making this central as well. I teach Intro to U.S. History. I teach History 108. It is a UK core course, very much introductory. And every student in that class, I did this in the spring as well, they are getting their own pocket-sized Constitution and Declaration. And we are really making these documents this kind of a centerpiece of the class, looking not just at how they were written and why, but then how they were continually evoked for decades and generations to come. And so we're doing a lot of that with our courses, making sure that anybody who comes into a history department course leaves with some basic civic literacy on the founding documents and this founding period, because it is so essential, not just for understanding that particular moment, but so much of what Americans would do subsequently. So it's really hard to understand anything in American history without really a good grounding in these documents.
I think it's interesting, too, that it's a nice combination of new courses and then also some of the faculty retooling and kind of adjusting existing courses to kind of help frame that in the conversation. Is the American Revolution course, is this fall the only time for that, or do you expect this is going to be kind of a
we'll keep offering it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. When students study this era and these particular topics, what do you notice that students are most surprised about when they are kind of looking at this in depth? And what are you hoping that that they take away from studying this particular moment? And keep in mind, we're talking about students who might not be majoring in history, moving on to different areas of study and going to get degrees in completely different areas, but definitely can take things away from this that helps in a formative way.
Yeah. In terms of surprise, I can get very specific with the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration, as we all know, it basically has 2 parts, the preamble and then the list of colonial grievances against the king. And I think that list has kind of fallen out of memory. I mean, people maybe vaguely know it's there, but they don't go back and read it. When we go back every July 4th maybe and look at the Declaration, we're focused on the preamble, which outlines the philosophical principles. But my students last semester, I had them look closely at the grievances and talk about them. And they were surprised by some of them. They were surprised by the specifics of some of those grievances. They kind of giggled at some of them. And, I think they were surprised when I talked to them about how in the moment, in the 1770s, the grievances were really what people were hearing or wanted to hear. These colonists, they needed to be persuaded to break their loyalty to the king. And that's what the grievances did. So I think that was surprising to the students. When it comes to the Constitution, I don't know if this was a surprise as much as something they just sort of struggle with. Parts of it are very hard to read and hard to follow the language sometimes. And so we really had to break it down into some, bite-sized sort of pieces. I think some of them, made comments like, oh, I wish they'd written it in plain English. And, well, the English of the time was a little different than the English now. Plus, this is a legal document. Look at some of our legal documents today. They're not exactly in plain English either. So I think, those were some things. But generally, what I tell them, what I want them to get out of reading these documents is they're not going to memorize them. I never think that's particularly useful, go memorize this passage or anything like that. But I want them to generally understand basically what's in there, but walk away from my class with an impulse to always go back and look. So when they have a question in their mind, they hear somebody say, this is constitutional or this is not constitutional. Well, have an impulse to go look at that for yourself. Don't necessarily trust what's on social media or what's coming third hand that's getting passed on like a telephone game on social media, but go look for yourself. Read the documents for yourself. That's what I really want students to come away from.
So I guess to really kind of tie this up and kind of come to a close on this, for you and for our Department of History, what's the feeling that and the hope that UK students and faculty and staff, and then also members of the public, can take away from not only this year of programming, but also just from the public observances and the things that they see in media? What are kind of some underlying things that you hope that people kind of come away with that might be useful in the national discourse?
Yeah. I think we would love to see people hold on to a historical perspective about the 250th. And what I mean by that is a curiosity about the how and the why. Why are these our principles? Why is this what we've inherited? Why did this declaration come at this particular point? These sort of how and the why, these are the historical questions. I think without that context, without that sort of curiosity about the how and the why, sometimes we don't fully understand what these principles are. The historical context matters. And so I guess, we can't in one lecture series or in 1 year give everybody a really deep history lesson that they're going to learn everything they need to know and we'll have it with them forever. That's impossible. But if we can help them understand what there is to read, what there is to watch, what there is to think about, what questions to ask, I think that's useful. So I hope we can help more and more of our students, of Kentuckians more generally, to just take a historical view of all these principles, step out of their 21st century perspective for a moment, and think about where this all came from and why we are at where we are today.
One of the things I've thought about recently and some things that I've watched is and I think kind of lends itself to today, is this idea that I think a lot of us may have had, in that this was a binary choice, that there's not nuance to it. And there is a lot of nuance to this, because it was not a situation of, are you going to keep going this way, or are you going to create this new country? It was not this A/B choice, because there were a lot of people initially talking about, we just want some representation in Parliament. Right. And so there was a degree of, there were lots of different angles that they could take and directions that they could go, and becoming a nation of our own was only one option in a lot of options. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can pull from that things that we look at today, that, there are not binary choices in things that we deal with today, that there are lots of avenues that we can go down to address issues and problems and try to solve those things.
I think that's really important. And it's not just, the average colonist at the time maybe wasn't seeing it as a binary. And we can see that. There were people at the time who kind of were loyalists, and then they sort of were with the colonists, or enslaved people, great example. Some of them were fighting for the British, some were fighting with the colonists, both with the same pursuit of freedom. The founders too, though, didn't always see this in a very clear-cut way. And I think sometimes we have a tendency to look back on this period, and we have absolutely put the founders on these pedestals, which there's good reason for that. There's a good reason to admire them. But I think sometimes in doing that, we've oversimplified them and have tended to assume that they knew exactly what they were doing always. And if you go back and you look at some of their writings, they're kind of agonizing and trying to figure out what to do. They're trying to figure out if independence is the right answer here. And that's an agonizing decision. But then comes the drafting of the Constitution. and they draft one, the Articles of Confederation. It doesn't work out very well. So then they start working on the federal constitution we have today. But even at the time, they're very divided. They're not sure. I think that's important to see for the reasons you say. And, maybe it's empowering today to look back on people in the past as, people who are struggling to figure it out too. And so when we are in these moments where we can't quite figure it out, doesn't mean all is lost. We can find our way through. We can find that pathway through. I think that's inspiring.
For someone listening who says, well, I'm not a historian, but I do want to understand this anniversary more deeply, where would you recommend somebody start?
I would recommend, I think actually the Ken Burns film, if they prefer film, is a great place to start. I think the 1776 lecture series at UK is a great place to start. And I just want to reiterate that this is free and open to the public. And they can find out more details on our history department website. Those, I think, are great places to start. I am also always happy to share a book list and a reading list with anybody who might like one.
Where can people go to find more information about the speaker series? I'm assuming that we've got all this listed on a website.
Yes. So we're calling this the Celebrating 1776 lecture series. So you could Google that at UK and that'll take you to our website, or you can go to the UK History Department's website, scroll down to events, and you'll see the list of lectures there. We
will put those links in the show notes for this podcast. As we approach this July 4th weekend, which is coming up, what do you hope people are thinking about kind of beyond the hot dogs and the fireworks and the parades and those types of things?
Oh, what a good question. It's so tempting to just put my historian's hat on and say, I want them to think about liberty and equality. and I do, but there is a place for just having a celebration and just having some fun. So, I guess I would love for people in this moment to, ask some questions about what they're celebrating. Yeah, I just hope in this moment that, maybe these celebrations, even as they're eating their hot dogs and, watermelon and whatever they're having, that maybe some questions will come to their minds about, it could even be, why are we all dressed in red, white, and blue? Why is it red, white, and blue? Why isn't it something else? Or questions about the Declaration, Why are we celebrating July 4th when actually it was signed in August of 1776? So, would love to see people ask questions, but enjoy this moment. We don't get too many of them.
I think that's a good thought of just kind of looking at the trappings of the day, and then maybe just taking an extra moment to just think about that in a sense of you're almost in the same way of looking at the room that I'm in and asking simple questions about the items in the room. You kind of look at the kind of the environment that you're in and ask those questions. And I think that's a great place of starting as far as why red, white, and blue.
Yeah.
I mean, the flag is a good place because of the representation of the stripes and the stars. But again, you can ask those questions of why stripes? Why stars?
Why is it designed the way it is?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think those are kind of excellent inroads.
I think history sometimes intimidates people too. They don't know where to start. And it's okay to just ask some basic questions like, why cherry pie? Do we eat that on a holiday like this? Or what's the significance of apple pie? Why do we think of that as so American?
Baseball.
Yeah, baseball. Yeah. Exactly. Chevrolet.
As the song goes. Well, this has been excellent. Amy Murrell Taylor, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about this, and have a happy and safe 4th of July. And to the people listening, I wish the same as well.
Yes, same to you. Happy Independence Day.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Blue. Behind the Blue is a production of the University of Kentucky. For more stories about how the University of Kentucky is advancing our Commonwealth, visit uknow.uky.edu.